How do you deal with that as a family?
Well, we don't, in many respects, need to deal with it.
The room was supposed to be routine. Senior staff gathered, schedules in hand, waiting for another controlled palace briefing. Then Princess Anne stood, produced a private letter written by Queen Camilla, and read its most damaging passage aloud. In seconds, the atmosphere changed from protocol to disbelief. Staff stopped taking notes. Charles said nothing. Camilla went pale, and Anne made clear that this was not gossip, but a line she believed had finally been crossed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne kept her voice steady as the words settled over the room. The Buckingham Palace household briefing was meant to coordinate aides, secretaries, ceremonial staff, and royal offices before major duties. The royal household is the network of staff and offices that keeps work moving. That was why this mattered. A private disagreement could be contained. An instruction affecting who received information could change who held influence. Camilla listened as Anne reached the paragraph that changed everything. The Queen Consort had written that certain consultations involving Anne should be reduced, and that future decisions should pass through her office first. She looked toward Charles, waiting for him to interrupt, but the king remained silent. That silence landed harder than any rebuke. Anne did not raise her voice. She placed the letter down and told the room that staff deserved to know whose instructions they had actually been following. Charles understood the danger. The issue was no longer whether two women disliked each other's methods. It was whether established working relationships had been altered without open approval. Anne had spent years being treated as one of the family's dependable working royals, and she believed the letter did more than bruise her pride. It threatened the trust, allowing royal offices to function without questioning every message. Camilla's expression tightened when Anne continued. A second paragraph suggested that briefings connected to the Princess Royal were to be rerouted without explaining why. The Princess Royal is the title given to the monarch's senior daughter, and Anne carried it with a reputation for duty. Now that role had been touched by instructions she had never been invited to discuss. The meeting ended, but nobody felt released. Staff left quietly, knowing a private letter had become an institutional crisis. Charles waited until the room had emptied, then asked Anne and Camilla to remain behind. Camilla looked at Anne and understood worse was coming. Anne had exposed the letter, but she had not explained how it reached her. The silence made one thing certain: the next truth would be harder to contain. The letter mattered because it struck at three people whose relationships had already been strained by rank, history, and loyalty. Anne saw herself as a guardian of duty. Camilla saw the household as something she had fought years to secure. Charles stood between them, husband to one and brother to the other. What unfolded was not simply a dispute over words on paper. It became a test of who could still command trust inside the monarchy. Anne had always measured her place through service rather than attention, and that was why the letter cut so deeply. Princess Anne had spent years building a reputation around consistency, responsibility, and showing up when others hesitated. Royal duty, in simple terms, meant the public and official work expected from senior members of the family. To her, that responsibility was not something to be reshaped quietly through private influence. It had to rest on trust, because without trust, every instruction became suspect. Camilla felt the wound differently. The Queen Consort had spent years trying to secure her place beside Charles, and the public reading of her private words threatened more than embarrassment. It challenged the legitimacy she believed she had earned within the household. She had survived criticism, suspicion, and years of comparison. Now Charles's own sister had questioned her judgment in front of the very staff whose confidence she needed. The humiliation was personal, but the damage was institutional. Charles carried the most painful burden of all. Defending Camilla too quickly would make it look as though he accepted the contents of the letter. Supporting Anne too openly would mean admitting his wife had crossed a boundary. In a side room after the briefing, the king listened as Camilla asked why he had allowed Anne to finish reading. He did not answer immediately. That pause hurt her more than anger. She understood, in that silence, that he was troubled too. Anne later spoke to a trusted aide in a private conversation and made her reasoning clear. She had not exposed the letter simply because her name appeared in it. What frightened her was that staff had already begun acting on those instructions. 2 internal meetings had been rearranged, and 1 briefing had already passed through Camilla's office instead of Anne's established channel. Charles received that confirmation through a documented staff account, and the reality became impossible to dismiss. The letter had already changed behavior. That meant the crisis had begun before anyone read a single word aloud, and now one question pressed harder than all the others. When had Camilla decided to write those instructions, and what happened between the 2 women before she did? To understand why Anne finally broke royal convention so dramatically, the story had to return to the meeting where one small change became the point of no return. Long before Anne read the letter aloud, one private moment had already made the rupture inevitable. At a Windsor planning meeting weeks earlier, Camilla had instructed a senior household secretary to remove Anne from a key staff consultation and route future decisions through her office instead. Anne discovered the change only when an aide quietly showed her the revised schedule. That single alteration turned irritation into suspicion, and suspicion into a determination to find out who had ordered it. Camilla had entered that Windsor meeting focused on upcoming royal engagements, staffing responsibilities, and the growing pressure to make several household offices work more efficiently. A royal engagement simply means an official duty carried out on behalf of the crown, whether a ceremony, visit, meeting, or public event. The discussion seemed ordinary at first, yet the real power inside such meetings often rests in who receives information first, because whoever sees a briefing early can shape a decision before everyone else is even aware it is being discussed. Anne knew that principle well. Days later, an aide brought the revised schedule to Princess Anne and pointed out that her name had disappeared from a forthcoming coordination consultation. She did not explode. She did not call anyone immediately. Instead, the Princess Royal became unusually still and asked only one question: who changed this? The answer came carefully. The instruction had originated from Camilla's side of the household. Camilla faced Anne privately soon afterward. The Queen Consort described the change as streamlining, arguing that too many separate offices were slowing decisions and that routing material through one place would create order. Anne did not accept that explanation. She told her plainly that efficiency was not the issue. Nobody had discussed removing her before the decision was made, and that absence of consultation made the change feel deliberate rather than practical. Anne pushed further. Through a documented account from the household secretary involved, she learned that the instruction had not been verbal alone. A written directive existed. She asked to see the original instead of accepting a summary, and the moment she recognized Camilla's signature at the bottom, suspicion hardened into certainty. The letter changed everything. Its language went beyond one meeting, suggesting that future briefings connected to Anne could also be redirected through Camilla's office. That meant this was not a one-off scheduling fix. It looked like the beginning of a new pattern. Anne made her decision quietly. She would not answer another private instruction with another private argument. The staff expected to obey those words would hear them exactly as written. Anne had found her proof, but once she chose to expose it publicly, there would be no retreat into polite explanations, and Camilla knew it. When Anne and Camilla finally faced each other after the reading, there were no smiles left to protect the room. Anne wanted one answer. Why had Camilla written instructions that appeared to reduce her authority and isolate her from staff decisions? Camilla insisted the letter had been misunderstood. Anne did not move. Charles watched the exchange harden by the second, until one sentence from Camilla transformed the argument from defensive explanation into a deeply personal confrontation. Anne waited until the last members of staff had gone, before pushing the letter back across the table. Only Princess Anne, Camilla, Charles, and one senior household secretary remained. A household secretary is a senior official who helps coordinate royal schedules, correspondence, and internal decisions. And that presence mattered because someone who understood the process was now hearing every word. Anne refused to turn the argument into a battle of personalities. She wanted responsibility named clearly. Camilla hesitated when Anne asked the question directly. "Did you write this?" The queen consort looked at the letter, then admitted that she had. But she immediately argued that the purpose had been distorted. She said the changes were meant to simplify communication, not diminish anyone. Anne did not accept that. She told her that simplifying a process was one thing. Quietly removing someone from it was another. Camilla pushed back harder. She told Anne that every household needed a clear center of authority, or decisions would become confused and divided. That sentence changed the temperature completely. The Princess Royal heard something deeper inside it, an assumption that she should simply accept being pushed outward, because Camilla believed control had to flow through her. Anne answered with proof. From a documented staff record, she produced the earlier version of the schedule, showing that her consultation had been included before the Windsor meeting. The revised version removed it afterward. That meant there had been no clerical mistake, no misunderstanding, and no innocent omission. Someone had made a choice. Charles stayed quiet until Camilla turned toward him. She said she had believed the king understood what she was trying to accomplish. The implication was immediate. If he knew, then Anne's anger had been aimed at the wrong person. If he did not, the problem was worse. Charles removed his glasses and set them beside the letter. Then he told Camilla plainly that he had never authorized Anne to be excluded from established consultations. The queen consort went silent. Anne did not look satisfied. She looked confirmed. The confrontation had stopped being Anne against Camilla. Now the question was, where royal authority actually began, and how far Camilla believed her influence could reach without Charles ever granting it. The confrontation exposed a harder truth. Palace influence does not always come from titles alone. It comes from access, calendars, briefings, private secretaries, and the confidence of the monarch. Camilla had tried to shape that machinery through a letter. Anne challenged it in public, but the person whose decision mattered most was Charles, and his silence grew more powerful as both women waited to see whether he would defend his wife or the system around him. Charles carried the letter into his private study and read every line again. The royal household works through overlapping offices, schedules, aides, and delegated responsibilities, meaning decisions can be shaped long before a formal announcement is ever made. That was why the document mattered. Camilla had not issued a decree, but staff had treated her words as carrying royal weight, because she stood beside the king and worked at the center of his daily life. Charles reached the passage involving Anne and stopped. The king returned to the beginning, read it again, and then placed the letter down without speaking. What troubled him was not only the wording. Staff had acted because they believed Camilla would never make such a change without his approval. Her closeness to him had created authority in practice, even where no explicit authority had been given. Camilla felt that judgment as abandonment. The queen consort had believed supporting Charles meant helping create order around an increasingly complicated household, and she had convinced herself that reorganizing information was part of that responsibility. Now the king was treating the same instinct as overreach. To her, she had been protecting his time. To Charles, she had crossed into decisions that required his direct consent. A senior secretary confirmed the deeper problem through a documented staff account. The staff had complied, partly because nobody imagined Camilla would send instructions affecting Anne without the monarch knowing. That revelation stripped away the safest defense available. This was no longer about one badly worded letter. It was about people acting on assumptions created by proximity to power. William was then briefed privately on the dispute. Prince William chose his words carefully, but the future king made his position clear. Household restructuring could not depend on private guesses about what the sovereign might approve. If responsibilities were changing, the authority behind those changes had to be unmistakable. Charles finally acted. The king ordered the disputed instructions temporarily suspended and restored the previous consultation arrangements while the issue was reviewed. It was not a public punishment, but the meaning was unmistakable. Camilla's letter no longer carried unquestioned force. Charles had stopped the document from shaping future decisions, but he could not erase what the staff had already witnessed, and Camilla was about to discover that once confidence in authority cracks, even the smallest hesitation can feel like a collapse. The consequences began before anyone left the room. Staff members who had followed Camilla's instructions suddenly questioned whether those orders still stood. Anne's aides demanded clarity. Charles retreated into a smaller office with 2 senior officials, while Camilla remained behind, visibly shaken by how quickly authority had shifted around her. The letter was no longer private, the staff were no longer neutral, and the palace now had to decide which instructions carried weight and which had become politically toxic. Charles moved quickly once the scale of the confusion became clear. The king authorized a formal clarification, restoring Anne's previous consultation access, and stating that future structural changes required explicit approval. Explicit authorization simply meant a decision had to be clearly approved by the person with the proper authority, rather than assumed from private correspondence. That distinction mattered because palace staff had been operating on trust. Once that trust became uncertain, even routine instructions could trigger doubt. Camilla felt that doubt almost immediately. The queen consort returned to her rooms and gave an aide a simple instruction, something that would once have been carried out without hesitation. This time, the aide paused and asked whether confirmation was needed first. The question was polite, but it struck hard. She suddenly understood what had changed. Her influence had not disappeared, but automatic confidence had. Anne reacted very differently. Princess Anne received confirmation from one of her aides that the old arrangements had been restored, yet she showed no satisfaction. She simply said the situation should never have reached this point. For her, winning back access did not erase the damage. Staff had already been placed in the middle of a family struggle, and that was precisely what she had wanted to prevent. Camilla's unease deepened when she learned through a documented internal account that Charles had asked his private office to review several recent household changes. The king wanted to know whether any other instructions had been acted upon without clear approval. That review made the crisis feel larger than one letter, because now every recent decision touched by uncertainty could be questioned. A senior secretary then revealed something even more striking in a private recorded conversation with another aide. Anne had received more than one opportunity to expose the letter earlier, but she had deliberately waited until she confirmed staff had actually obeyed it. The Princess Royal had not acted out of impulse. She had waited for proof. Camilla folded a duplicate copy of her own letter and placed it away without calling anyone back into the room. For once, control offered no comfort, and while she sat with that silence, Anne and Charles were preparing for the conversation that would decide everything. For the first time since the crisis began, he would have to answer her not as king, but as her brother. The turning point came away from staff, advisors, and ceremonial language. Anne and Charles met privately, with the door closed and no aides present. She did not ask him to punish Camilla. She asked whether he still expected her to serve the crown, while accepting private efforts to weaken her standing. Charles listened without interruption. Then he admitted that the letter had crossed a boundary he could not defend, forcing him to choose between personal protection and institutional trust. Anne spoke first, but this time there was no fury in her voice. Princess Anne made clear that she was not trying to outrank Camilla, defeat her, or turn the family into competing camps. The crown, in simple terms, means the institution of the monarchy and the official duties carried out in its name. Her point was painfully simple. She could not be expected to carry those duties faithfully while decisions affecting her work were made around her without warning. Charles answered with the wound he had been carrying all day. The king told Anne that reading Camilla's letter before the entire staff had humiliated his wife in a way that could not easily be undone. He did not excuse the letter, but he wanted his sister to understand the cost of exposing it. Anne accepted that. Then she answered just as plainly, Private attempts to diminish someone could eventually create public consequences. Anne's anger finally gave way to disappointment. She told Charles she would have accepted almost any decision if it had come directly from him. If he had wanted her role changed, she said, he should have looked her in the eye and told her himself. That admission struck the monarch harder than accusation because it exposed what had really broken between them. The problem was not losing influence, it was losing trust. Charles then gave Anne the answer she had been waiting for. In their private conversation, he admitted he had never read Camilla's letter before she sent it. The king could not honestly claim those instructions represented his judgment because they had never been placed before him for approval. That confession settled the central question. Charles went further. The disputed changes would not merely remain suspended, they would be permanently withdrawn. Anne's established consultation arrangements would stay in place, and any future alteration would require clear approval. Charles walked his sister to the door himself. Before Anne left, he said quietly, "You should have been told." She paused, nodded once, and asked for nothing more. Inside the palace, the argument was finally settled. But outside those walls, word of Anne's extraordinary decision had already escaped. And what began as a family confrontation was about to become a national judgment on Camilla, Charles, and the crown itself. By morning, the private humiliation inside the palace had become a national spectacle. One newspaper front page reduced the crisis to a single image. Anne leaving Buckingham Palace upright and unsmiling beneath the headline, "She read every word." Television panels replayed the account of stunned staff, while a crowd gathered outside the palace gates, debating loyalties. For Camilla, the deepest wound was no longer what Anne exposed, it was that the public understood why she had done it. Camilla saw the front page before breakfast was finished, and pushed it aside without reading the full story. The Queen Consort understood immediately what had changed. Palace communications staff were trying to contain the damage by acknowledging that internal instructions had been reviewed without turning the disagreement into an official conflict between senior royals. A palace clarification, in simple terms, is a carefully worded statement designed to explain an internal decision without exposing every private detail behind it. But careful language could not erase the emotional force of that headline. Anne reacted with far less satisfaction than many expected. Princess Anne told her staff not to celebrate the coverage or treat public support as proof that she had won. She knew the argument had already cost the family something deeper than reputation. The public debate had split around two painful questions: whether Camilla had overreached by trying to redirect authority, and whether Anne had crossed her own line by reading private correspondence before the household. The reaction outside Buckingham Palace made that division impossible to ignore. Broadcasters delivered live updates as a growing crowd gathered near the gates, some applauding when Anne's name was mentioned, while others argued that family letters should never have been exposed publicly. The moment captured the crisis perfectly. People were not simply choosing sides, they were debating where loyalty ended and accountability began. Charles watched the pressure build and chose to settle the practical issue before speculation could distort it further. The king authorized a concise internal clarification, confirming that Anne's previous working arrangements remained in place, and that the disputed instruction carried no continuing authority. He avoided attacking Camilla, but he also refused to leave doubt about the outcome. Camilla understood what that meant. The Queen Consort still stood beside Charles, but the authority implied by her letter had been stripped away. Anne understood something equally painful. Public vindication could not repair private trust. The headlines would eventually disappear, but the judgment they captured would remain. Charles, Anne, and Camilla were left with consequences no press statement could erase, and the final question was no longer who had won. It was what each of them had permanently lost. The final judgment was not written in a decree or delivered from a balcony. It was visible in what happened next. Camilla's disputed instructions were withdrawn, Anne's role was restored, and Charles made clear that private influence could not override established duty. Anne had forced the monarchy to confront an uncomfortable boundary. Camilla lost more than an argument. She lost the assumption that her authority would remain unquestioned. The crisis ended with one unmistakable lesson: trust had to be earned again. Charles made the decision permanent. The king restored the previous consultation structure and made clear that any future change affecting senior members of the family had to carry open approval rather than rely on private assumptions. A consultation structure simply means the established way royal offices share information and include key people before decisions are made. That mattered because the crisis had shown how quickly influence could become authority when nobody stopped to ask where the instruction had actually come from. Anne returned to her duties without demanding punishment. Princess Anne asked for no apology ceremony, no public humiliation, and no symbolic victory over Camilla. She had wanted the boundary restored, and once that happened, she refused to turn the moment into a personal triumph. Yet vindication brought little comfort. She knew she had exposed a family member before staff simply to force an issue she believed should have been handled openly from the beginning. Camilla accepted the consequence in a quieter way. The queen consort remained beside Charles and lost neither her title nor her place in the family, but something more fragile had changed. Staff would no longer automatically assume that every preference coming from her office carried the king's approval. Her influence survived, but unquestioned confidence did not. Charles also understood his own responsibility. The monarch had allowed uncertainty to grow around where his wife's influence ended and his authority began. That uncertainty had damaged Anne, exposed Camilla, and forced him into the very choice he had hoped to avoid. Silence had protected nobody. The next senior household briefing carried the final meaning. Anne took her usual place. Camilla arrived shortly afterward and gave her a restrained nod. Anne returned it. Charles looked at both women before beginning the meeting, acknowledging, without another argument, that the rules between them had changed. Anne had won the boundary, but not without pain. Camilla had lost automatic trust, but not her place beside Charles. And the king had finally made clear that closeness to the monarch could never replace explicit approval. The monarchy survived because the letter did not disappear into silence. Its mistake was confronted, its authority was withdrawn, and the line it crossed was finally recognized. Anne paid with family trust, Camilla with personal influence, and Charles with the illusion that he could remain above the conflict. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.